Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of FFG Live. My name is Evan Johnson and today we're going to be doing a panel on crafting narrative in games. So today I have with me these three fine gentlemen. Would you like to introduce yourselves and what you do here at the company? Starting with you, Matt.
So, I'm Matt Newman. I'm a senior card game developer with the card game team at Fantasy Flight Games.
Okay. You're most known for...
I worked on Lord of the Rings, the card game, and Arkham Horror, the card game.
Yeah. Okay, great.
My name's Sam Gregor Stewart. I'm the manager of the role-playing department here at Fantasy Flight. I've worked on the Star Wars role-playing game, Warhammer role-playing games, and Genesis and Legend of the Five Rings role-playing games.
My name's Dan Clark. I am nominally in the board game department, but I get my fingers into a lot of different pies. I have worked on everything from Warhammer RPGs through Arkham Horror, 3rd edition, through Descent and Legacy of Dragonholt, and all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, you're kind of like a story master of sorts.
Of sorts, sure. Let's go with that. Story master.
We'll get to that.
Story vagabond.
Yes.
Vagabond.
Traveling from game to game, righting wrongs.
The story troubadour.
I'm who they call when things go wrong.
So we have some questions prepared to talk about story. If you guys have questions about the narrative of games, how stories work in games, how like building the lore for a universe works, feel free to ask those in the comments. Got that up here, so I will be watching that, and I'll ask some of your questions as well. So to get things started, our games, FFG's games, are kind of known for having this very strong narrative thread, right? You're not just like taking care of vineyards in Italy, right? Typically you're on like maybe some kind of adventure, or there are like story beats throughout the game. What advantages does kind of having that narrative bring to these games, and why is it such an important tenet for us here at FFG? Anyone?
Well, first of all, I want to speak out in defense of games about taking care of vineyards, because that can be, if it's well crafted, be a very strong narrative.
Absolutely.
I feel like Agricola is one of the most thematically engaging games I know of, just because it really makes me feel like I am a starving farmer.
Sure, but it's more of an emergent narrative rather than a
Yes,
crafted
an emergent narrative is an incredibly powerful tool
Yes.
that we can use. That's what makes our games different from a movie or a book or whatever.
Yeah.
Is the narrative that we as designers can give our best shot at giving you the tools for, and then the players have to bring that to the table. I've sort of lost the thread there. Anyway, point is, why narrative? Lots of reasons. I think the one, like some of them are obvious, just like, hey, we are humans and we tell stories, and stories are fun, and that's how we communicate our values and our traditions to one another. It's how we pass the time. It's we are creatures that love stories. And it's another way to engage with our games. Some players are not very good at all of our games, but if the storytelling experience was really compelling, then they'll come back for more. This is, for example, true of me all the time. And the one that I think people overlook is that a coherent theme buys you more complexity in gameplay. If we have a game, here I'm borrowing from the talk I did with John Yang. If we have a game that just has sort of abstract gray plastic pieces of like, here's a unit that has the basic move and attack power, and here's a unit that stays put and attacks twice. Those are all special abilities we have to remember, but if I tell you that one is a stormtrooper and one is a EBM engineer on a big blaster machine gun bipod, then you have a much easier time remembering the differences between those mechanics, because it's all hooked into a narrative that your brain is already very good at putting together and following.
Sure.
So lots of reasons why we put narrative in our games, and one of them is that we get to
up the complexity.
Up the complexity and do more stuff at once. Because we are better at stories than we are at math. I am better at stories than math.
Yeah, speak for yourself.
Speak for everyone.
I would also add that having a strong narrative or strong emergent storytelling inside a game allows you to craft experiences that are really memorable. Like, you know, if I just have like red cubes, blue cubes, and green cubes, and I'm just pushing them around, I might be, you know, I might be having a lot of fun in the moment, but I'm not going to remember that in 3 years. But, you know, the moment where I ran out of ammo shooting the ghoul priest and you came in with dynamite and saved me, that I'm going to remember that. You know, that's going to
that's a good call, because like, I mean, I might have as much fun, you know, doing a jigsaw puzzle as I would playing one of our games, but I don't really remember the last time I did a jigsaw puzzle. Like, I might remember like, oh yeah, putting that last piece in felt great, but that's about it. You know, so maybe that's kind of gets to what you're saying there.
I think if Fantasy Flight has a sort of secret sauce, it is we're trying to get that moment after the game when you're telling stories with your friends, like, oh, do you remember the time? Do you remember the thing that happened then? And that, I think, is the through line of all of our often very, very different games mechanically, is that we're all trying to get to that storytelling moment, that after action reminiscence.
Absolutely.
Memory, form memory.
In the chat, CBS Inc. is asking, other than art, how do you incorporate a strong theme into the narrative?
I think tone and mood is a big part of it, at least especially with Arkham, but also with, I know for sure with L5R as well. We try to set a tone for everything and then stick with that theme throughout the entirety of the process.
It can, one of the most earliest examples I remember of this actually is, I'm very old, by the way.
You look absolutely ancient.
So I'm going to bring up some games that I think nobody else here remembers. The original Doom board game, Kevin Wilson.
Does that make me old if I remember that?
It might. Great fun. You're running around, you're shooting demons, tracking ammo. And then the same system re-implemented for Descent just a couple of years later. And some very... They're subtle changes, like the dice, instead of having this ammo symbol that means you lose a resource, instead they have this surge symbol that means you gain more ability to do interesting stuff. Like, that is a relatively arbitrary distinction on a mechanical game design level, but it creates an enormous difference in theme and the experience of playing the game. Instead of being this sort of desperate skin of your teeth running out of resources thing that Doom was, now it's this more heroic, splashy, engaging thing that Descent became. So we are, if we're doing our jobs well, and I hope that we more often than not we are integrating theme through, not just through art, not just through the words that I like to put everywhere. I apologize to editors. But also through even small mechanic choices that we're making.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think even in really minor mechanics, you can create sort of narrative and theme. When for a couple of years, I also worked on Star Wars Armada, and one of the minor elements of that game that I think actually has a big thematic impact is that in the game, instead of most miniatures games where you move and then you shoot, in that game it's reversed. You shoot and then you move. And it's a minor thing, and most people probably don't think about this that way, but when you do that, it means that you're thinking about where you're going to have to be next turn, every turn, and that reinforces this idea of like naval combat and sailing ships, all these activities where you're always having
ponderous
planning ahead and going forward with that. So I think you can pick some very minor elements of gameplay and or some mechanics, and they'll actually have a big impact on theme. I know when we were working on the Star Wars role-playing game, early on when we were testing out dice probabilities, the triumph symbol didn't, for people who might not be familiar with Star Wars, a triumph symbol, think of it as like a critical success. If you roll it, you're more likely to succeed, but you also, something else awesome happens in your game. However, when we first designed it, the triumph symbol didn't have the success element. It was just something else awesome. and that
Right.
meant probability-wise,
Yeah.
you rolled a triumph, you were actually less likely to succeed in what you were setting out to do.
It was feeling bad to roll triumph.
Exactly.
Because it meant I failed the test.
Because
Yeah,
I
remember
get
that.
less successes. So that was a switch we had to make in the gameplay, because that narrative was that theme and narrative was counterintuitive to what people expected.
That's so. So you just said like the theme and the narrative is counterintuitive to what people expected. We had a question here from Sunny Headcase asking, "Is there a difference between theme and narrative, and what would you say that is?"
Ooh. Yes.
They're
Yeah.
closely tied.
They're also asking if you need to have facial hair to craft good narrative.
No.
I would say yes.
No, absolutely
No, that's not true.
You need facial hair to be on camera.
That's fair.
Oh, God.
None of these things are true.
I didn't have a beard when I started.
Oh.
So I guess not.
I think it's a
Unless I only started getting good.
I think
No,
it's a Minnesotan thing more than a narrative thing.
Yeah, that's fair. So theme and narrative.
Speaking about theme and narrative, I think the theme sort of permeates through everything. It's more cohesive than just talking about the narrative. Like the theme can permeate through the game design, the art, the storytelling, everything, like the whole package, even the graphic design. If you take a look at something like Legend of the Five Rings, the themes of that game are all throughout everything, even the font. Like it's that cohesive.
Yeah.
So it's yeah. I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's kind of like theme is an umbrella,
Well, I
Sure.
think the other half of that then is, theme is more overarching. Like you're saying, narrative is one element of that. Narrative is the plot. It's the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas the theme is the trappings and how
The
it
narrative
appears.
is what happens. The theme is sort of why, what it's about, what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are related but separate
Nice.
concepts, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah, corporate dystopia may be a theme, but Monster Slayer is a narrative about corporate dystopia.
And I think that more than just like corporate dystopia being a theme, I think the themes are more about things like corporate responsibility and how much like the enemy you can become before you are the enemy, and well, anyway, so we're not going to give you an English seminar here.
Are you sure?
We could.
So a typical story, in a video game or a, say just even a book, right? It could follow like a 3-act structure with, your setup and your creation and your resolution, rising action, the climax, etc. How is designing a narrative for a game both similar and different from that for a board game specifically? Or a role-playing game?
God, this is the sort of thing I've been hammering my own brain over the past 6 months.
It sort of depends on the game too.
Yeah.
Like some of our games contain like a whole 3-act structure or a whole story in one playthrough.
Yeah.
But some of our games are more of a campaign where it's
So you
a
can
much
do that multiple
longer.
times.
Yeah, like RPGs especially, but also Arkham LCG. So it's kind of hard to say exactly if that 3-act structure falls in. But the tricky part is storytelling can come through the gameplay as well. So for you, the climax might be when you did something that, in Bob's group, he didn't do at all. That climax never happened for him because that
Right.
story played out differently when he was playing.
Right.
Yeah.
But is there a way then that you kind of approach design to make sure that a climax happens for everyone?
For sure, yeah.
It's definitely something that we keep in mind when we're designing like individual Mansions of Madness scenarios where they'll be working out the early part of the game, the mid-game, the finale, and just how much the gameplay and the tone shifts between these moments, and just sort of trying to step back from the narrative level and talk about the competitive head-to-head games too, like trying to keep a sense of rising tension over the lifespan of the game, and so that the most interesting the game doesn't outplay the climax, right? Like if you win on turn 2, I don't think you should still be playing on turn 6.
Right.
So that's not just a narrative design thing; it's also a game design thing.
Most games are designed competitive or cooperative to build from a more minor point up to a denouement, like a finale, and then there's a wrap-up point afterwards. So following some very basic structure like that. In most miniatures games, there's usually a turn or two where most of the action is going down, and then afterwards it's maybe a few desperate acts and so forth, but for the most part you know how it's going to turn out. For board games, similarly, right, you build up, you improve your characters, you fight ever or go against ever increasing challenges, and then ideally the final challenge is the most difficult. Role-playing games is a little trickier than that because we don't, setting aside pre-published adventures, we don't control your story and your narrative.
All we can do is give you the tools.
And usually neither do the game masters.
No, that's very true. So we can encourage people to build, to craft a narrative that incorporates those elements. In Shadow of the Beanstalk, the most recent Genesis supplement, a big part of our Game Master chapter is talking about taking basically hooks that get people into adventures, escalations that increase the tension and increase the danger that the player characters are under, and then climaxes that wrap that up in some suitably dramatic fashion. But all we can do is provide the tools at that point.
Yeah, I've noticed that's something that is pretty commonly included in a lot of the RPG books, is like a whole game master chapter, to which a good portion of which is dedicated to like, here's how to craft a compelling story. Right?
Yeah, they're
Exactly.
the best ones are agnostic of the actual game wrapped around them, right? It's just like, here's how to handle it when your players go off the rails, because they will go off.
Yes.
There are no rails.
So at FFG, so we have a number of our own universes, such as like Android, Legend of the Five Rings, Arkham Horror, Cheernoth, and commonly with those, there's some kind of like source material, right? Whether that's, like drawing from kind of the history of L5R, taken from like H.P. Lovecraft and other similar American horror authors for sort of that mythos. But beyond sort of like whatever source and how we might draw on it, what goes into creating these universes and shaping what they become?
A lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of our most established universes don't they don't spring fully formed into being from just sitting down like saying, all right, we're gonna create a new world. It's gonna be called Terranoth. Let's start the process. And I think the best settings evolve over time and grow over time. Terranoth started out with original Runebound and Disc Wars, I believe.
Yeah, so it goes back to Battle Mist and Disc Wars.
Right.
Yep.
And over the years, it has grown significantly since those early games and changed a lot. But I don't think we could have created a setting, like, for example, the Realms of Terranoth setting book, which is the closest thing you're going to find to a gazetteer of the world these days. But we couldn't have created that if we hadn't had all of that material and all of that experience and all of that work to draw on over decades. And I think most good settings, especially the ones we work on, have that backup that to draw on.
I think we are getting a little more systemic, or maybe we're just getting better at it. If you look at Keyforge, for example, does not have decades and decades of history behind it. It, in fact, only has one game. It's only one game into the Crucible setting so far. Hopefully you like it. I think it's pretty fun. But I think you are right that what we have now is not, in any sense, the final form of this setting. This is one lens, one look into this enormous and complicated setting through which we are going to hopefully be visiting many, many times over the years. And it's going to be pretty fun watching it evolve. And I say watching it evolve, even though I'm sort of, nominally the head of the Crucible Story Group, because building all this stuff is collaborative. We want to empower our developers. We want to get the team all involved, all in contributing content, ideas, cool faction designs, monsters, whatever. Because I think that that is how we get sort of the most interesting and awesome stuff from this really engaged team. So I guess the answer is we start with some inspiration, and then we just start playing in the world, and we build it as we need it. Some planning ahead, but not too much, because what if we have a really great idea?
Right. You don't want to lock yourself down prematurely. So a question from the chat. So they're asking about 3 most important tips for narrative. So maybe if you each gave one, whoever comes up with one
For like
first.
creating a narrative,
Yeah.
or
It just says 3 most important narrative tips. So take that as you will.
I'm gonna make believe he's talking about creating a narrative.
Yeah.
I like it.
I would say engaging characters. The characters are sort of the lens through which we view the universe, and if you can connect with those characters, then you can really connect with the setting and the universe as a whole.
Right.
I think if every character that showed up in all of our games and in all of our narratives were people that we didn't really care much for, then we wouldn't really care much for the universe either. So you gotta make those characters people that you really care about.
Yeah.
I want to add something to that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Actually, which is, as you're creating a narrative, keep in mind who your audience is. Probably going to be your players in a role-playing game or board game or whatever, but make sure that the story is focused on them. This is a particular issue in role-playing games, is that as game masters create a narrative that they're really excited about and they want to share, they can lose track of the fact that they're not novelists. They're basically presenters, they're directors, but the main characters always have to be your players, or the avatars your players represent. So don't make your narrative 2 to 4 hours of you telling your players what awesome things the characters they aren't get to do.
How
Right.
awesome their non-playable character is.
Exactly.
The players aren't your little puppets to like play out this drama.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say empower your audience. I think particularly for game narrative, game fiction, you want to leave sort of corners that are not filled in yet for your audience to start building on what you've presented them. I think that's also true for like the emergent narrative at the table. We want to many of our games are established IPs that are not our own, right? We have Game of Thrones board game, for example, and I think we want to provide the tools, but not force compliance with an existing story, right? It's the same idea of like the railroad GM, right, or the one who deprotagonizes the PCs, but we want to let the audience take that story wherever they want it to go, because they're the best judges of what they want. Maybe, I hope.
Yeah. Well, that's how every game of Twilight Imperium is, right? It's like here's a board, here's a bunch of really cool different factions and species that you can play as. Craft your story.
Right. There's no established one true answer.
Right.
Do your thing.
Yeah.
Give them the freedom to play. Yeah. I think that's good.
Absolutely. Do you have any kind of favorite bits of lore from any of our worlds? Like some kind of little detail that's just your favorite. Do tell.
Can I just say Pingle?
Pingle? Sure.
Pingle
you
who
want
annoys.
to Pingle who annoys?
No, actually, I think one of my favorite characters from any of our universes is Kaito Kosori.
Okay.
She's just a really interesting character, and I
Yeah.
love reading about.
She had that whole novella written about
Yes.
her, right?
Yeah. The
Remind me of its title.
The Sword and the Spirits.
That's the one.
Yeah.
That is an
So
L5
if you
novella.
haven't read it, read it. It's really good. I like it a lot. Yep.
Awesome.
I think for me, it's just like all of the little background details that Matt Zellinger puts into all of the Android illustrations.
Yeah.
Like, just like the little corporate branding logos in the backgrounds, the cartoon characters that become toys, that become Commander Cool, the champions of the challenge zone. Like, I love that stuff.
And in general with Android, I think just the way in which the Android universe meshes with our own, I think is really intriguing and interesting. Like the history of the Android universe is fantastic.
That and Arkham, from different views, right? Like Arkham always has to go back to actual history of the 20s, and I know everyone who works on it does a really good job actually like doing their research.
Yes.
Wait, were chainsaws invented yet?
yeah. What did they look like?
I remember the one comment about the bulletproof vest card.
Oh yeah.
Like, wait, is that a thing?
But yeah, and why does it look like that? It's like that's what bulletproof vests look like. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other side of that is Android, which is extrapolating out what our history is going to look like
Future
sometime from now. Some unspecified number of centuries from now.
Yeah, that's awesome.
If we still have a planet.
Yeah, hopefully it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
We're very optimistic.
That's why, that's why people say it's not a total dystopia, because we assume we still have
It's like
yeah.
some percentage dystopia.
Okay, so to ask, I guess, so directed to Matt, but then you guys can hop in if there's something applicable. So when you start with an Arkham Horror LCG campaign, something brand new, what are kind of like the first stages that you go through in that?
So often, I mean, the first thing we do when we work on any product is we come up with some sort of vision for the entire campaign. So in the case of Arkham, it's going to be outlining the story.
Okay.
And I usually start with a mood board and a sort of
Nice.
cohesive theme that's going to be the through line for the entire campaign.
Yeah.
So for example, with Forgotten Age, it was pulp horror.
Sure.
Pulp action.
Interesting.
For The Circle Undone, it was more gothic horror or existential horror, dealing with themes about life and death and what does that mean and stuff like that.
Whereas like Path to Carcosa, it's like the nature of madness.
And psychological horror,
exactly. Yeah,
that sort of thing.
That's cool.
And breaking the fourth wall and things like that. And then I'll craft an outline for the entire story. Where are we going to go? What are the beats? What are the major story beats that are going to happen? How's it going to begin? How's it going to end? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's usually like the first couple weeks of any campaign.
For sure. How do you choose like the new investigators that are going to be added to a deluxe expansion?
It's kind of a mix. So some of them are connected to the story. Like for when we did Path to Carcosa, it was not even a question. It was like, all right, Lola Hayes has to be in this, right? Like her story is that she's an actress who was in The King in Yellow. So she has to be in this expansion. Yeah, she's a shoo-in.
Yeah.
For some investigators, maybe their ability deals with themes that are popping up in the cycle. For some investigators, I just had like a really good idea for their ability, so it just kind of like fit naturally into my personal schedule.
For sure.
And then other times it's just filling in gaps. Oh, we need a survivor for this set, or we need a certain kind of character for this set. We need somebody really good at combat or something like that. Who should we use? And so we'll just fill in the gaps that are left after all that.
For sure.
Yeah.
With how many investigators that are currently like part of the Arkham Horror Files universe, like how big a deal is it to add brand new investigators to that, as we've done a handful of times?
It's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of characters already.
Yeah.
So
there's probably like 40 or 50 some?
There's more than 50.
More than
yeah.
50?
There's
Okay.
Read the Investigators of Arkham.
Yeah.
You see exactly how many characters there are.
Yeah. And even more after that too.
Yeah.
Right. How many there were 2 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So it's a big deal because we need to find a character who isn't like sort of treading the same ground as these existing characters, because for Arkham the characters are a huge part of the IP. I mean they're like half the IP.
Sure.
Are these beloved characters. So if we're adding a new character, we need to make sure like this character fits into the IP, this character isn't treading the same ground that we already tread with some existing characters, and also this character is intriguing enough to warrant like the additional inclusion.
Sure.
Because if we added 100 characters tomorrow, it'd sort of dilute the pool so much that it wouldn't be as we wouldn't feel that same connection, I think, to them.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but so Arkham Horror LCG is kind of an ongoing, more continuous experience. It's a campaign style versus something like Arkham Horror 3rd Edition or a lot of our other board games where it's like a one-time experience that you can then replay, right? And there may be different scenarios that kind of tweak things a little bit. How do we kind of ensure like a unique narrative experience in those board games specifically?
I think those single scenario games, especially the larger ones like Arkham Horror, the board game, the story is told more through the emergent gameplay than through text being delivered to you as a player.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you agree? That I think a lot of what happens in those games is I'm making the choice to go here.
I think some of that also is that you're exactly right. The starting point is determined, where the characters start, the status they're in, the challenges they face, and the ending point is determined in most of those games because they'll have some final challenge to overcome,
or several ending points,
ending point or points,
right.
But it's the middle that's emergent and left up to the players at that point. And so I think that's one of the things that helps create a unique narrative with that, is because it's that combination of scripted and emergent narrative. Most groups may end up at the same one of three choices at the end, but what it looked like when they got there, how they got there, all of their experiences along the way, that's unique to that group's playing.
I think that for Arkham Horror 3rd, at least, there's also the sort of combination of scripted and backdrop narrative at work. Like the scripted narrative is those codex cards that are evolving a fairly tightly controlled plot at semi-controlled times, depending on how well
Except
or
when I'm
poorly,
playing.
depending on how well or poorly the players are doing at spinning the plates. But then there's also the encounter decks, the clue cards, the just random things that you see or experience in the city of Arkham that are all, each of which are these tiny little snippets of narrative, 30 to 50 words, probably even less, that happen one encounter phase by encounter phase. And taken together, those start to add up and build for you a picture of not just Arkham, but Arkham in this particular circumstance. And I think that use of backdrop narrative is an important part of how we build and provide the tools for the emergent narrative that we are hoping is happening at the table.
Yeah.
You could sort of think of it as a giant bag of Scrabble tiles, each one with a bullet point on it. You're picking them out, setting them one by one, and then reading the story of what evolves. So with that many different elements, how can it not be different each time?
Yeah, sure. And I think also another key factor is providing to the players the ability for them to add in their own storytelling and their own creativity and inject themselves into the game in that way.
So a little vagueness is actually useful at that
point. Oh yes, yeah. I find that can actually enhance the experience. If you're just telling the player everything that's happening at any given moment, then they're not really using their imagination, they're not really engaging. But if you allow those gaps, like how did I get from downtown to Riverside, or how did I get from this point to this point? Did I take a car? Did I hire a cab? Like those are instances where I can kind of figure that out in my head. Maybe I don't have to say it out loud, or maybe I do, whatever.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like those kinds of leaving things up to the player's imagination is where you can kind of get replayability even out of a scenario that is relatively tightly controlled, right? Like you've played it, you know the story, you kind of know the beats, right? You play it again, and maybe even you play it a third time. It's like like all the events are going to happen, but in those spaces in between where you're like, oh, this time I've got a shotgun, I'm going after these monsters,
Definitely.
Wendy Adams, no.
Where did you get that?
Murder Wendy is the best version of Wendy. Genesis sourcebook, something that we've done kind of like, delving specifically into these universes that we've had. We've done 2 of these now for both Tiernoth and for Android. So how do you kind of in those like intertwine new lore with the mechanics of an RPG?
Yeah. I'm going to copy what Dan said earlier and say it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. Whenever we create a new source book, we start out trying to figure out what elements of the IP we really want to focus on. Frankly, Terranoth and Android are too big to cover in a single book.
Certainly.
I mean, probably too big to cover in 4 or 5 books. Even.
Right.
So we pick that focus first, and especially you see this with Shadow of the Beanstalk. Even at that point, narrative becomes an issue. So the reason we focused on what we did in Shadow of the Beanstalk, which was New Angeles, the Beanstalk, and Heinlein as the main physical locations, was because the narrative of the stories we wanted to tell in that particular book was average citizens getting caught up in big events. Like, it's a huge world out there, you're one small person in it, and sometimes your best bet is to survive, to make a little money. You're somewhat powerless, and you have to struggle within those within the constraints of much bigger things going on around you. So knowing that broad narrative, we knew where we were going to focus on to focus in the books, the book, and that let us determine what lore we needed to provide as well. So we knew we had to, if we were presenting a role-playing game where you're playing average New Angelinos, a lot of the lore and locations had to be places that average New Angelinos would go. It couldn't just be this macro view of New Angeles. It had to get down and talk about this random hole-in-the-wall restaurant, Fish and Chips in Esmeraldas, or this block that's been cordoned off while it's still under construction, and people keep hearing noises from the sealed buildings at night, and they don't know what's up with that. Or the
Probably nothing.
it's fine. It's fine.
I'm sure it's fine. Everything's fine.
The farm that Los Scorpiones bought that they totally don't bury all the bodies of the people they kill in. So that determined what we were going to write about. Then with mechanics, once we know the stories that people need to tell, we can look at the mechanics that already exist and determine if there are any new mechanics we need to create to help tell those stories. As an example, when we did Shadows of the Beanstalk, we knew one element of Android that was super important was going to be interacting with the network. So we knew that we had to create, we had to adapt the already existing hacking rules from the core book, but make them feel substantial and immersive and interactive enough to actually support characters whose whole story is going to be interacting with the network. Like, they're not going to be shooting people, they're not going to be talking to people, they're running all the time. And if
Always be running.
Exactly. If the game system doesn't empower that, if it's boring for them to be doing that, then we failed. So that created our focus for, we had to put some work into those rules, as one example.
Yeah.
And luckily, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but luckily the game mechanics for Genesis is sort of built around the idea of meshing the core system with new settings. So
Yes.
that helps a lot.
That is definitely the idea. So it was helpful in that regard.
I think that you touched on something interesting there about our IPs in general, and that because of who we are as a company and how we manage this, our IPs to our intellectual properties, our settings, in order to really function and thrive, they need to be big enough and broad enough, diverse enough, they can support multiple different games. So like, yeah, a character who just interacts with the network and is just running on corporate servers all the time, that could be an entire game.
Right.
Gosh. And then there could be an entirely different game about corporate politics and trying to maintain the city. So I think that choosing where to focus your attention is a very important step towards doing a Genesis sourcebook, doing any of our games, because trying to do everything is not going to work. You know, you cannot do a game about all of Earth.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe you could. Somebody prove me wrong, but I think you're going to find that even if you do a game about all of Earth, it's going to wind up being focused on, the geology of it or something.
Yeah, as a elaborate on that, you're right. Your game is going to be focused on a specific element of whatever setting or narrative you're creating, no matter what. That's just the nature of not being able to create a game that is literally living life. So you're going to be focused
Have
on.
we?
Yeah. So assuming this isn't all a Matrix-like simulation, you can't create a game that's everything. So it's going to be focused on something no matter what you set out to do. So the best thing you can do is make sure you've decided what that focus is going to be beforehand, and you don't blunder into something that may be good, may be bad, may be boring, but you won't know until you're there. So
Yeah, that's true even for games where you have 3 or so games that are all dealing with sort of the same themes and the same elements of an IP, just lasering in on different sort of macroscopic levels of it. So like Arkham Mansions and Arkham LCG, are all very similar games in terms of what the overarching goals are for you and what you're doing, but they deal with like different levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. So our IPs, obviously, are the universes that we're creating, and they span like a wide number of games. Most of them have more than one game associated with them. Who are kind of like the keepers of these different universes, and like what's the process look like for creating or like advancing that story? Perhaps the most prominent example is like L5R, right, where it has a kind of a story that's constantly driving forward, as opposed to something like Arkham, which is relatively kind of static and things happen and stories play out.
Each story in Arkham is like its own universe.
But we're not like hitting like an hour in the 30s, or something like
Because
that.
half your Arkham stories end with the world being destroyed.
It's almost like that.
So there are, each of our IPs has at Fantasy Flight a story group. And each story group is made up of around 4-ish people. People from dev, often from art.
development.
Yes, development, often from art. And people who are either intimately familiar with the setting or have worked on it in the past or bring some sort of outside expertise. We have a guy in our Terranauts story group who just is a medieval historian reenactor guy, so that's awesome.
Nice.
And it's important to point out the members of these story groups are a range of employees for the company. It's not. There are people who do other things. We are all members of various story groups.
Yeah.
And none of us is story group a full-time job. But
Right.
in many ways that's actually works better because one, you don't have one person who is the single person in charge of an IP and creating a one-person failure point, basically. And you also get a breadth of experience, like Terranauts benefits from Mike being intimately familiar with how actual medieval armor and swords work. But then also, I was going somewhere with that, and now I lost it.
So each story group functions a little differently. The source of the sort of guidance for how to shape the evolving storyline is going to be different from group to group and from game line to game line.
Yeah.
Right.
Like the Arkham horror storyline doesn't generally evolve.
Yeah, so with Arkham, for example, it's mostly about making sure that characters show up where they should show up, and
Right.
the setting is still 1920s. There aren't like pieces of technology from the 30s or the 40s showing up randomly. But ultimately, we kind of leave the actual narrative and storytelling to each individual developer working on their product. Whereas, for example, L5R, it's a lot more cohesive, and I know they spend most of the time that they spend with story group meetings going over the story and where it's going and what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Android's story group is more focused on making sure that we maintain that sense of relative scientific realism. So this technology that's a little too unrealistic for what we're trying to do, sure, that'll work.
Or not just unrealistic, but it just sort of drives the setting towards themes that we are not interested in exploring.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, too much nanotech in Android makes that a nanotech setting and not a setting about transhumanism and all the other things we're interested in exploring. So,
besides, if you lose resource scarcity, then the whole corporate dystopia element goes right out the window. Or does it?
yeah, okay. We all saw that coming.
Seems like you guys are on the same page about that. So Dan, you've written 2 novellas.
I have.
For us. You wrote.
You should read them. They're great.
Across the Burning Sands, an L5R novella, and Monster Slayer, an Android.
Yes.
So what was like the experience of working on those, and how did you kind of approach like building onto the universes in such a substantial way?
Yeah. Okay. So. They were both pretty different experiences because they happened not only at different points in my own career, but also at different points in sort of where we were as a publisher of novellas.
Yeah.
So like Monster Slayer was, I believe, the first one written under our new sort of
Right.
publishing novellas, although it was not the first one released.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that was sort of a learning experience both for me and for Katrina Lee, our editor. And that was like I for that one I literally remember wandering around the halls of the office with a sheet of paper and asking people who their favorite Android characters were.
I remember you asking me.
And then like I selected the 3 or 4 front runners and sat down and sort of like, well, what would a cool story that focuses on this character be? Wrote up a pitch, did that for, I think I had maybe 5 pitches that I developed and sent them off to Kat and to. Were you involved at that point? I don't know.
No,
They were Michael Hurley probably.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was Michael
and then we sort of focused in on a small subset of those, developed those more, picked one, and then I went off and worked on the outline and wrote it. So that was. I started from the point of which characters to want to explore.
Right.
And then I found what I thought were interesting parts of their narrative. Well, in this particular case, it was Raina. And I wanted to explore her, sort of her trauma, her damage, and her mission, and show us what that war looked like from her perspective. So then it was just a matter of details, right? The details of the plot are they're not irrelevant, but there were many viable choices could have been made there.
Right.
Also, Princess Space Kitten.
Also, Princess Space Kitten had to be in it because it's fan favorite.
That's the list.
And by fan favorite, I mean me. So that was great. And then for the Unicorn novella, for Across the Burning Sands, I had just been sort of trying to get up to speed on Legend of the 5 Rings. I had played the game a little bit in college, and at the time I was like, I don't know anything about this setting, so I'll just choose to play as the clan that doesn't know anything about the setting, the real wacky Gaijin. And then it turned out that I really liked the Unicorn clan, so that was the right choice. So I spending a lot of time thinking about how we were reimagining the Unicorn clan in this in our reboot of the IP, and doing some research on Mongols. We draw a lot of influence from the Mongol Empire for the Unicorn clan, and sort of spitballing ideas for like changes to their history or new concepts to work into the clan, ways to examine their sort of conflict between being foreign and being Rokugani at the same time.
Right.
And at some point, and as I was just sort of spitballing these ideas, Katrina Lee, our editor, was like, hey, why don't you work that up into a pitch for a novella? And so I did. And it was terrible. And it was like a 600-page novel, most of which didn't need to be there anyway. So threw out most of it and boiled it down to the parts that were actually interesting and worked from there. And that was about wanting to explore. It was always about Shono. Even my initial terrible pitch was about Shono and trying to sort of grow into the role of becoming that next champion.
Yeah.
So that was the interesting part to me, and then using that as a vehicle to really explore across the setting. So like the details of the plot were again not a thing that were handed to me, right? It was, we decided sort of as a group that where I was going to focus. I worked out what that was going to mean, and the story group was involved in terms of like thumbsing up or down specific details,
Yeah.
but I was not handed a outline like, here, write this book.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think in general we work that way.
Yeah, I think broad strokes, I think that's how the previous investigator novellas have been written as well, where it's just like, you're going to write a novella about such and such character, and they would come with a pitch of events. We didn't say, okay, it's going to include these other characters, and they're going to go to this setting, and they're going to do this.
Yeah, the author has a lot of freedom to figure out what the story they want to tell is, and we have a lot of freedom to tell them that particular story is probably a bad idea.
It's a question of, can we gently course correct, like nudge things back on track, or in rare cases do we just have to kill a pitch and say start over?
Sure.
All part of the process.
I do want to say, Tristan Wolf in the chat says, I absolutely loved Burning Sands. Favorite L5R novella yet.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for that.
We are just about out of time, but do you guys have any kind of closing thoughts here on narrative in games? Any, we kind of gave tips, but any advice or closing thoughts for people looking at, learning from this?
I think one thing that is worth keeping in mind is that don't be afraid to embrace or use or even subvert tropes and other and sort of stereotypical storytelling devices. We're talking about 3-act structure and so forth, but also just plot twists and everything. Don't be afraid to use that in your games. I'm speaking of
typical characters.
Exactly. Those elements, people tend to see those and tend to be like, oh, I recognize that, and then, let me show you that I know these things, and sort of vaguely make fun of it because I can recognize this thing you've used. But these elements are archetypical for a reason, and people respond well to them. They tend to make good stories, and a lot of times it can really help to start from somewhere familiar when you're designing your own narrative, and then elaborate from there, as opposed to getting stuck thinking you have to come up with an entirely new narrative that is completely unique, and then you just spend like days or weeks coming up with nothing, or coming up with stuff that people are going to hate, or it's better to start somewhere that you know about and be able to build and then be able to run from there than not going anywhere at all.
It's the old saying from film, 2 cliches make us laugh, 100 cliches move us.
Yeah.
It almost makes you think of the earlier point about complexity budget, right? Like if you, in the same way that hooking a narrative onto mechanics lets you sort of juggle more mechanics, use of stock tropes sort of reduces the cognitive load on your audience in addition to your storyteller. And
that's a good point.
it's the same way that we're not going to, like, the Realms of Terranoff book is not going to detail every kind of tree and bird and blade of grass, right? Like, we're just going to rely on you to know that there are birds, they're what you expect they are, we're going to move on.
Dwarf and elf culture have certain traditional dwarf and elf culture elements, but what that lets us do is say, hey, and then this is how it's different, which is more interesting usually in general.
I agree.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, and this is, I guess, more a comment on playing our games than about like crafting your own games or crafting your own narratives, but I would just say don't be afraid to use your own creativity and your own interpretation of events, even while we're supplying you with our own interpretation of those events. I think the best stories in games come from when you take part in the narrative and sort of engage directly with the game.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why RPGs are so good.
Yeah, but, I mean, RPGs obviously for sure do that.
But
even
all
if you're not,
games.
even if you're not playing, and even if it's not a storytelling game.
Oh yeah.
Even if it is a game where you're pushing blocks around, right?
Yeah.
Like, creating that narrative through line in your own head can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody so much for watching our little panel that we had today. Make sure that you hit that bell icon and subscribe so that you'll be notified whenever we post some new content. Come and join us in 2 days on Thursday. We're going to be back here. We're going to be playing some Keyforge with the new Age of Ascension decks. We're going to be doing a reversal format, so some maybe not so competitive Age of Ascension decks that might be seen here on the stream. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for joining us.